It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, the kind of mellow English day when the air held a soft chill, and the leaves were just beginning to turn that dignified golden hue that made even the most ordinary hedgerow look poetic. In St. Mary Mead, that meant only one thing. Mrs. Partridge's garden club would meet at 3:30, and the early church bake sale would be set up in the vicarage hall by 4. These routines were not to be questioned. They anchored the town like the steeple anchored the church. At precisely 1 o'clock, as the hands of the old pub clock clicked into alignment with ceremonial pride, the bells above the Dog and Duck gave their subtle chime, and the door creaked open on a gust of cooler air. He entered then, a man in his mid-50s perhaps, well-dressed, but in the sort of way one would expect from someone who wanted to be inconspicuous and yet couldn't quite manage it. A dove-gray wool coat, sharp black boots that gleamed with polish, and a dark hat, tilted just enough to shadow his eye. He carried a book under one arm, and paused before selecting a table in the far right corner, one that gave him a good view of the whole room, but left his own back safely to the wall. Dorothy Pindle, the pub's barmaid, noticed him immediately. How could she not? He wasn't one of theirs. Mary Mead wasn't the sort of place where strangers came unless they were passing through, and even then they were mostly lost, deliverymen or terribly optimistic hikers. But this man didn't look lost. Nor did he look He ordered a ploughman's lunch and a half pint of bitter, spoke with a crisp accent that had the faintest tinge of London polish, and sat down to eat in complete silence. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look out the window. He simply ate, slowly, alone. It caused a quiet ripple. Mrs. Hartnell, seated by the window with her customary scone and pot of Earl Grey, raised one eyebrow, so high it nearly disappeared into her hat. Across the room, Reverend Clement glanced up from his crossword, took in the man's deliberate posture, and went back to 6 across, a 5-letter word for sin. He wrote pride. The stranger visited again the next day, same time, same table. This time a shepherd's pie and a weak shandy. Again he said very little. By the 4th day it had gone beyond mild curiosity. Now it was proper village speculation. Perhaps he's writing a book, murmured Mrs. Price at the baker's counter. Authors do come to the countryside for that sort of thing. Or he's one of those inspectors, offered Colonel Denham grimly, disguised as a traveler, looking into old business, war records maybe. He never smiles, said Millie at the post office. Not once. I watched him the whole time on Tuesday. Just eats and reads his book. Watches people too, said the vicar's wife, her brow furrowed. Not directly, but I felt it. It was a week later, during the Tuesday darts night at the Dog and Duck, that Miss Marple first noticed him herself. She wasn't usually one for pubs, but she had come to deliver a parcel of knitted socks to young Terry, the barman's nephew, and decided to sit for a moment while the mist cleared outside. She ordered a small lemonade and took a quiet place near the hearth, where the fire snapped warmly and the smell of roast potatoes and hops mingled agreeably. There he was, exactly as described, reading, always reading. Miss Marple, of course, didn't stare. She never needed to. Observation for her was a quiet business. She noticed the trim of his fingernails, perfect. The way he buttered his bread, always from corner to center, never edge to edge. The way he ate, clean, efficient, but without enjoyment. A man who was accustomed to eating alone, but not necessarily by choice. She also noticed something else, a detail so minor it might have slipped past even a particularly keen village gossip. The book he read was a battered 1932 edition of The Ghost in the Drawing Room by Helena Lawrence. Not popular, not recently reprinted, not in fact the sort of thing one read for idle pleasure. The novel had been based on a real unsolved murder. The Lawrence case, famous in some legal circles for its ambiguities and social scandal. That Miss Marple thought was interesting. She would have let it go, as she had let many odd things go in her life. But then the next morning came the scream. It was Nora Davies, the vicarage cleaner, who found the body, right there in the Dog and Duck's back garden beneath the pergola beside the rain barrel, face down, lifeless. It was Dorothy Pindle, the barmaid, dead. Miss Marple, on her morning walk and just passing the inn, arrived only moments after the constable. She looked at the stiffening figure beneath the ivy. She looked at the gathering villagers, shocked and swarmed. She looked at the corner window inside, still lit, where the stranger had always sat, and she thought quietly to herself, well, that is rather unusual. Within the hour, the dog and duck was cordoned off by a single length of yellow rope, hastily strung between a pair of broom handles and supervised by young Constable Babcock, who looked as though he'd just swallowed a hedgehog. Miss Marple did not speak unless spoken to. She simply stood with her gloved hands resting on her handbag, watching as the scene unfolded with the precision of a tragedy one already knew by heart. Dorothy, poor girl, had been just 27. She had freckles on her nose, a habit of biting her lower lip when thinking, and a fondness for putting too much lemon in her tea. By mid-morning the rumors had begun spreading faster than the mist that still lingered over the hedgerows. Miss Price was sure it had something to do with jealousy. That blonde hussy had no shortage of admirers. Colonel Denham swore it was the work of a vagrant. Shelters don't keep them anymore, and there's no telling what they'll do. Millie from the post office quietly told 3 people it was a drug matter. You'd be amazed what goes through village pubs these days. Miss Marple knew better than to believe any of it, at least not yet. She had learned long ago that people often layered their assumptions like icing over an old fruitcake, thick, sweet, and wholly deceptive. The stranger had not been seen that morning. According to Terry, the barman's nephew, he had left the previous evening just before closing time, paid in cash as usual. No trouble, no complaints. But Miss Marple remembered his gaze, the way it lingered not on Dorothy but beyond her, watching something or someone. Inside the Dog and Duck, the police had finally let Dr. Hale, the village GP, examine the body. He emerged some time later, wiping his glasses with a frayed handkerchief, his face clouded with the sort of grim expression that only confirmed what everyone had already feared. Neck broken, he murmured. Blunt trauma at the base of the skull. Possibly a fall, but unlikely. There's some bruising, hand-shaped, I'd say. This wasn't an accident. He glanced nervously at Miss Marple, who met his eyes without flinching. He cleared his throat and added, time of death was likely between midnight and 4 in the morning. Difficult to say exact. I'll know more after the post. The word murder was not spoken aloud. Not yet. But it hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. By the time the inspector from Much Benham arrived, the villagers had divided neatly into factions, those who were frightened, those who were thrilled, and those who saw in the tragedy a strange kind of opportunity. Miss Hartnell was already halfway through composing a letter to her niece in Bath. Murder in our very own village, can you imagine, darling? While Reverend Clement cancelled choir practice and began preparing a sermon about the fragility of mortal life. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned home and took out a small notebook. She did not write anything yet. She simply opened it to a fresh page and sat by the window, watching the ivy rustle on her garden wall. Her mind moved with quiet, precise clicks. Dorothy had been cheerful but private. She had worked at the Dog and Duck since she was 16. She had no known enemies, no obvious secrets. But Miss Marple had always believed that everyone, no matter how ordinary, had secrets. Sometimes they were small, harmless things, unspoken desires, petty thefts, romantic regret. But sometimes, just sometimes, they were the sort of secrets people were willing to kill for. The stranger returned the following day. He entered the Dog and Duck just after 2, when the pub had reopened under grim necessity. His expression was calm, not unaffected, but he wore the same dove-gray coat and ordered nothing to eat, just a cup of tea and a slice of Battenberg, which he didn't touch. Terry served him with a look that was equal parts suspicion and defiance. But the stranger didn't flinch. He sat in his usual corner, opened his book and began to read. Miss Marple, who happened to be visiting the vicarage and had taken a scenic route back through the village, paused on the pavement outside the Dog and Duck. From her vantage point she could see the stranger quite clearly through the window. Not reading, she noted, pretending to. His eyes weren't scanning the page, they were flicking up, watching, measuring. She made a quiet decision and stepped inside. The room fell into that peculiar hush that only ever seems to happen in English pubs when something unanticipated occurs. She moved past the few other villagers who sat in stiff silence, and without asking permission, sat opposite the man. I do hope you won't think me rude, she said pleasantly, but I find myself suddenly in need of a cup of tea, and all the other tables are full. There were of course 2 entirely empty tables. The man closed his book. He did not smile, but he nodded. Not at all. Please. Miss Marple studied him over the rim of her teacup. His hands were very clean, a faint ink stain on the side of his right thumb. His nails trimmed short, not the sort of grooming one maintained for vanity, but for habit. His voice, now that she heard it more closely, had a slight hesitation in it, a practiced neutral tone that tried very hard not to sound like anything at all. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," she said. "I'm Jane Marple. I live just beyond the churchyard, near the lane with the old gate." The man hesitated, then extended a hand. "Daniel Lacey. Have you been in the village long, Mr. Lacey?" "A little over a week." "I see." She sipped her tea. He did not ask any questions of her in return. That was notable. "And may I ask," she said gently, "what brings you to St. Mary Mead?" He hesitated again. "Peace, solitude. I've been meaning to do some reading." "Helena Lawrence," she said, gesturing toward the novel on the table. "Rather a dark choice for light reading, wouldn't you say?" Mr. Lacey's eyes flicked up just once. "It's a curiosity. The case was never solved." "No, it wasn't," Miss Marple agreed, "though I have always thought the cousin did it. Most people are fooled by the maid's testimony, but I thought it too rehearsed." There was a pause. Then for the first time, Daniel Lacey smiled, just barely. "You're quite observant." "I find it helps," Miss Marple replied mildly. "In a village such as ours." He closed the book and stood. "I should go," he said. "I have some calls to make." "Of course." But before he turned, she added quietly, "You knew Dorothy Pindle, didn't you?" That stopped him, only for a moment, but it was enough. "I knew her only as one knows a server in a pub," he replied smoothly. "Pleasant girl, very capable." Miss Marple nodded. He left. She watched him until he vanished down the misted lane. Outside, the clouds thickened, and a gentle rain began to fall. Inside, the pub's chatter resumed, quiet, nervous, speculative. Miss Marple sat alone, still sipping her tea, her mind already sorting through timelines and glances, through gossip and gaps in memory. Dorothy Pindle had known something important, and someone, perhaps Mr. Daniel Lacey, had known she knew. Not proof, not yet, but it was a beginning. The rain lingered for the rest of the day, steady and thin like a veil, casting a dull gleam over the cobbled lanes, and soaking the ivy that curled around garden gates. Miss Marple, having returned from her encounter with Mr. Daniel Lacey, did not light the lamp immediately. Instead, she sat in her sitting room, letting the gray afternoon deepen around her, her knitting left untouched in the basket beside her chair. She thought about the slight tension that had crept into Lacey's shoulders when she mentioned Dorothy. It hadn't been shock, not in the way someone feigns surprise. It was smaller than that, subtler. A pause, like a man trying to step over something in his mind before answering. It had been many years since Miss Marple had been startled by the face of evil. Most of the time it looked terribly ordinary. The next morning, the village awoke to another surprise, not as grim as Dorothy's death, but sharp enough to shake the growing sense of routine. A note had been slipped through the door of the Dog and Duck sometime during the night. No signature, no handwriting, typed, single sheet, and only one sentence. She knew about the man from the Lawrence case. Terry found it crumpled behind the front door, beneath the post, and handed it straight to Constable Babcock, who then brought it wide-eyed and earnest to Inspector Cray from Much Benham. Inspector Cray was a man of logic and procedure. He was careful in his work, if a bit slow to see around corners. He read the note 3 times before folding it carefully into an evidence bag. "Publicity stunt, perhaps," he murmured, "or someone trying to stir trouble." Miss Marple, who had made a quiet point of stopping by the pub for a pot of tea Terry had reopened only for light service, did not comment, but she did ask, as if in passing, whether Mr. Lacey had been in that morning. "No, Miss," Terry replied. "He's taken a room at the Hartwell guest house. Haven't seen him since yesterday." Miss Marple said, and smiled faintly. "And Dorothy, did she ever mention him?" Casually. Terry frowned. "Not really. She served him, same as anyone. Bit quiet," she said, "but polite." "Did she ever seem concerned?" Terry scratched behind his ear. "Now that you say it, week or so ago she did seem a bit twitchy after her shift. Stayed behind to double-check the locks. Said she saw someone outside by the rain barrel, late at night." "And did she say?" "No name, just said it gave her a chill." Miss Marple nodded, thanked him, and took her tea to the bench just outside the pub, where the drizzle had stopped but left the air thick with dampness.
Dorothy had felt watched. That fit. But it also meant she'd noticed something.
The reference to the Lawrence case in the anonymous note stirred something deeper. Miss Marple had followed the Lawrence case with interest when it broke 20 years earlier. A well-to-do solicitor's wife poisoned in her own conservatory. No sign of forced entry. No evidence of theft. No confession. The press had spun tales of intrigue and betrayal, though the trial collapsed due to insufficient proof. The husband vanished abroad. The cousin inherited the house. The maid was dismissed, and the case remained famously unclosed. But more than the case, it was the way Mr. Lacey had handled the book. Not casually, not as a reader, reverently. The way one handles memory. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a short walk to the Hartwell guest house under the pretense of delivering a tin of quince jam to Mrs. Hartwell, a woman of practical instincts and incurable curiosity. The guest house had been part of her family for 3 generations, and she ran it with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her den. "Oh yes, Mr. Lacey's still with us," she said, accepting the jam with grateful hands. "Paid a fortnight in advance. Always polite, though he keeps odd hours. Comes and goes like a mist." "Does he receive any post?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "None that I've seen," Mrs. Hartwell replied, lowering her voice. "But I've caught him in the garden once or twice at odd hours, just standing." "Standing?" "Yes. Not pacing, not walking. Just standing. Looking out across the hedge like he's expecting someone." Miss Marple thanked her, praised the begonias, and made her way home through the quiet lanes, her step slow but sure. She paused once at the old stone wall near the rectory, her gaze drawn to the telephone wires overhead and the single jackdaw that sat watching her. Dorothy had noticed something that tied Mr. Lacey not just to St. Mary Mead, but to the Lawrence case. The question now was, what had she done with it? She spent the evening with her notebook open, listing names and connections. Dorothy, Mr. Lacey, the Lawrence case, the book, the note. Then something occurred to her, a small, curious gap. She rose and walked to the small shelf near her fireplace, where she kept village booklets and pamphlets. Old parish records, church fates, war memorial announcements, and yes, even a few copies of the Mary Mead Review, an infrequent but lovingly typed newsletter distributed every quarter by the Women's Institute. In the spring issue from 2 years ago, nestled between a piece on preserving lemon curd and an editorial about hedgerow conservation, was a notice: "New residents. We welcome Miss Dorothy Pindle back to our community. After 3 years in service to a family in Hampshire, she returns to take up permanent residence with her aunt and resume work at the Dog and Duck." Miss Marple tapped the page. Hampshire. Helena Lawrence's murder had taken place in Hampshire. She sat very still, her hand resting on the arm of her chair. Then without a word she crossed the room and reached for the telephone. The next morning she stood once again in the Dog and Duck. The pub was quiet, just a few locals at the bar and Inspector Cray in the corner booth reviewing his notes. She walked directly over to him. "Inspector," she said with characteristic softness, "I do believe Dorothy may have known the victim in the Lawrence case." Cray looked up, his brows narrowing. "Come again." "She worked in Hampshire for 3 years, likely in domestic service. It's entirely possible that she was employed, however briefly, by someone connected to Helena Lawrence, or someone close to the household." He blinked. "You think she recognized Mr. Lacey?" "Not at first, but I believe she grew suspicious, and if she did, well, that might explain why she became frightened, why she stayed late to check locks, why she mentioned the Lawrence book perhaps without meaning to." Cray was listening now, properly listening. "And the note?" he asked. "It's typed. No prints. No sign of forced entry at the pub." Miss Marple folded her hands. Whoever left it knew enough to draw attention to the connection, but not enough to be sure what Dorothy actually knew. It could be someone trying to shift suspicion or someone trying to help. Cray exhaled slowly. "You think Daniel Lacey is involved?" "I think Daniel Lacey is not who he says he is," Miss Marple replied gently. "And I believe the key lies in Dorothy's time in Hampshire." She paused, then added, "If you speak to the agency where Dorothy was placed during those years, I suspect you'll find she once worked at a house not far from the Lawrence estate." Cray stood, already pulling out his notebook. "We'll make that call." As he moved off, Miss Marple turned back to her tea. It had gone cold, but she didn't mind. Outside, The mist had returned, curling low against the garden walls. Somewhere beyond the hedges and stone paths, the truth was inching closer. It was only a matter of time. The morning after Miss Marple spoke to Inspector Cray, the village stirred with a quiet tension. Word had spread without ever being formally announced that the investigation had taken a new turn. The Lawrence case, once only a whisper in the pub and a curiosity in a stranger's book, had now threaded itself into the fabric of St. Mary Mead. People walked a little faster past the Dog and Duck. Windows that once stayed open for air were now shut in silence. Something was building slowly, deliberately. Inspector Cray had acted quickly after their conversation. He telephoned the domestic placement agency in Hampshire first thing that morning. The woman on the other end, brisk and helpful, confirmed that Dorothy Pindle had indeed worked in the county. In fact, her second placement during that period had been with a retired civil servant and his invalid wife at a small property barely 15 miles from the old Lawrence estate. The household, according to the records, had connections to the late Helena Lawrence's family through the sister of the deceased solicitor. Dorothy had remained there for just under a year. Cray stood by the vicar's telephone table, notebook open, listening carefully. "Did Dorothy ever mention the Lawrence case?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "Not to me, but you should know. We received a letter from her about 6 weeks ago." Cray straightened. "A letter?" "Yes, handwritten. She asked if we still had records of her old placements, particularly that one. Said she was writing something for a friend who collected crime stories and wanted to confirm the names of the household. She asked whether the Lawrence estate was ever involved in her employment, directly or indirectly. I thought it an odd request." "Did you reply?" "I did. Told her what I've just told you, that we had no record of her being with the Lawrence family, but that she had worked near. I posted it to her at the Dog and Duck." Cray's jaw tightened slightly. "Thank you. That's very helpful." When he hung up, he looked across the quiet study at Miss Marple, who was seated uninvited but welcome in the high-backed armchair beside the fire. "She was digging," he said, "looking into something." "Yes," Miss Marple replied calmly, "and she may have struck gold." Cray nodded slowly, "And that may be what got her killed." Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady, cloaking the village in a muted hush. Miss Marple stood and gathered her gloves. "If I may, Inspector, I believe it's time someone paid Mr. Lacey a visit. Not formally, not yet, but a conversation, casual, perhaps over tea, might yield more than direct questioning." Cray studied her for a long moment. "Are you certain that's wise?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I've sat with worse." That afternoon she arrived at the Hartwell guest house, just as the sun slipped behind the church steeple, casting long shadows across the gravel path. She wore her dove-gray shawl, the one she reserved for afternoon visiting, and carried a tin of oat biscuits. Mrs. Hartwell answered the door and blinked in surprise, but didn't hesitate. "He's in the lounge," she whispered. "Reading again. Same book." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped inside. Daniel Lacey looked up from his corner chair as she entered. The Lawrence novel was open on his lap, but he hadn't turned a page in some time. His expression, composed as ever, flickered slightly as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod, "twice in as many days. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I thought you might enjoy some biscuits," she said, setting the tin down on the small table between them, "and perhaps a chat." He closed the book and gestured to the other chair. "Of course." They sat in silence for a moment. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the space between their breaths. "I've always thought," Miss Marple began softly, "that certain books find us at precisely the wrong or right time. Helena Lawrence's story was always more than fiction, don't you think?" He gave a slight unreadable smile. "It was based on a real case. But yes, the novel took liberties. You seem to know it well." "I've read it before, several times." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "Did you know Helena Lawrence?" The question landed without drama, but it changed the atmosphere between them. Lacey did not react with alarm. Instead, he looked at her with a tired patience, as if he had been waiting for this moment to arrive. "I knew her once, a long time ago. She died under strange circumstances." "She did. Poisoning, wasn't it?" "No charges, no conviction, a great deal of speculation." "Yes." Miss Marple reached for a biscuit. "You were never questioned, I suppose?" "I wasn't involved." "No, but people rarely think they are, until someone else starts asking." He looked at her then, not with anger, but with a sort of wary interest. What do you believe, Miss Marple? She dabbed her lips delicately with her handkerchief. I believe Dorothy Pindle remembered something small perhaps. A phrase, a name, a photograph in a hallway, something she had once seen but not understood until recently. Daniel Lacey's expression didn't shift, but a faint color rose in his cheek. She asked the agency for her placement records. Miss Marple continued. She wanted to confirm her memory, and when she did, she must have realized who you were, or rather who you had once been. His voice when he spoke again was low. I never hurt her, perhaps not directly, but secrets can have weight. She may have threatened to expose you, or perhaps, and here Miss Marple's voice lowered even further, she told someone else, someone who had even more to lose than you. Lacey looked away, his gaze fixed on the dying light beyond the window. I didn't kill Dorothy. No, I don't believe you did. He turned back slowly. But someone close to you may have, Miss Marple said gently. Someone you've protected for a very long time. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of breath and memory, and something almost like grief. He didn't speak again, but when she rose to leave he stood too. Not out of politeness but solidarity. I won't run, he said quietly. I never thought you would. She returned home as the church bells rang 6 times through the mist. In her parlor she lit a small lamp and watched the light stretch across the carpet. She believed Daniel Lacey, not innocent, but not guilty, not of this. He carried old burdens perhaps of cowardice, or silence, but not blood, which meant the answer still lay ahead. Not in the past, but in the present. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone had known what Dorothy discovered, and that someone had moved swiftly, and without hesitation. It was no longer about what Dorothy had known. It was about who else had learned it, and what they were prepared to do to keep it buried. The next morning broke pale and dry, the rain finally having lifted, leaving behind a damp crispness that clung to the hedges and rooftops. Miss Marple rose early, though she had barely slept. She had sat long into the night beside the little writing table beneath her parlor window, not writing, not reading, simply thinking. Pieces were beginning to fall into place, not neatly, not yet, but enough for her to sense the shape of the truth beneath the surface. She dressed with quiet purpose, selecting her charcoal wool coat and fastening the silver pin shaped like a snowdrop at her collar. She had always found that people underestimated women who wore floral brooches. The day's first stop was not the police station nor the Dog and Duck, but the churchyard. Dorothy Pindle's grave had not yet been dug, her body still held by the coroner in Much Benham, but Miss Marple believed that reflection sometimes came best among the stones of the departed. The church was empty, save for the sound of distant sweeping from the sacristy, where young Hilary Godfrey polished brass for Sunday's service. Miss Marple sat in the third pew from the front and folded her hands in her lap. She thought about what Daniel Lacey hadn't said. There had been no mention of family, no mention of why he had come to St. Mary Mead in particular. The connection to Dorothy could no longer be doubted, nor could the likelihood that he had a deeper tie to the Lawrence case than he admitted. But if he hadn't killed Dorothy, then someone else, someone even closer to that old, unsolved death, had followed her here. Someone she might have spoken to before she died. It was time to look more carefully at the villagers themselves. Miss Marple began with a short list, which she rewrote in her mind as she made her way toward the vicarage. There was Reverend Clement, naturally trustworthy, but occasionally too wrapped in his thoughts to see mischief under his nose. His wife Griselda, sharp as frost and full of chatter, might know more than she realized. Colonel Denham, who claimed to have met Lacey's type before, had shown too much confidence about the man for someone who supposedly didn't know him. And then there was Millie at the post office, who had mentioned drugs of all things. Why such a strange specific theory? At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Griselda in the kitchen arranging a tray of medicine. "Do sit," Griselda said at once, gesturing to the chair beside the old pine table. "I've just made tea." Miss Marple thanked her and watched as she moved with her usual graceful efficiency. It wasn't long before the conversation turned, as expected, to Mr. Lacey. "He gives me the shivers," Griselda confessed, stirring her tea with delicate precision. "Not in the sense of danger, just sadness. You know, the sort of sadness that seems to have no origin, like it's older than the person carrying it." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "though sometimes it does have an origin, only a hidden one."
"Do you think he's dangerous?"
"I think he knows more than he says. but I also think he's protecting someone, or has done, for a long time. Griselda's eyes lit with interest. You think it's a family matter? Possibly. Perhaps a sister, or a wife. Someone close enough to create a bond of silence. Griselda leaned forward slightly. There was a woman with him. The first morning he came into the village. I saw them both, from the parlor window, just a glimpse really. But she had light hair, wore a blue coat. She peeled off quickly down the lane near the post office. I never saw her again. Miss Marple's hand paused over her saucer. That's never been mentioned. I assumed she was a driver or a guest house worker. Griselda, but now that you ask, I've not seen anyone like her since. Would you recognize her again? I think so. Miss Marple finished her tea and thanked Griselda, her mind now tracing a new thread. A woman, present but invisible, gone before the village began watching. Someone Daniel Lacey had come with, but had not acknowledged. The next stop, naturally, was the post office. Millie stood behind the counter sorting envelopes with the brisk authority of someone who had read more of people's business than they imagined. Good morning, Miss Marple, she said, flattening a bundle of bills. You've missed the post, I'm afraid. Oh, I'm not posting anything, Miss Marple replied. Just collecting a few threads. Threads, stories, memory. You mentioned something peculiar last week about drugs in the village. Quite unusual for St. Mary Mead. Millie flushed slightly. Oh, that was just talk. You know how people exaggerate. Of course. But it's such an unexpected detail to imagine. I wondered where you'd heard it. Millie hesitated. It wasn't public knowledge or anything. Just something Dorothy mentioned once. Said she saw a man handing off a parcel behind the Dog and Duck late one night. Thought it was odd. I told her not to get involved. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Did she say who the man was? No. Millie replied too quickly. Just said it looked suspicious. She joked it was probably nothing, but I could tell it worried her. And did she mention it again? No. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Thank you, dear. That's helpful. Outside, the air was turning cool again, the sky slipping into the soft silver that often came just before dusk. She walked slowly, letting the conversation settle. A man with a parcel, a woman with a blue coat, a connection to an old scandal in Hampshire, and Daniel Lacey, standing in the village like a man carrying something buried under his ribs. At home, Miss Marple found a note slip through her door. It was not typed like the first. It was handwritten, in a firm but elegant script. She told me. I warned her to stop. She wouldn't. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. There was no name, no address, no envelope. Just those 3 lines on a torn bit of ledger paper. Miss Marple read it twice, then walked to her desk and laid it beside her notebook. It was not a confession. It was fear. Fear laced with regret. Whoever had written it had not yet spoken to the police, but was close to breaking. She did not believe the note had come from Daniel Lacey. The handwriting was too fine, too exacting. A woman's hand, perhaps. Someone educated. Someone near. She took out her notebook again and turned to a fresh page. A new list. Not suspects this time, but possible senders. It was time to visit the library. Not for books, but for files. In a village like Mary Mead, old newsletters, sign-in sheets, and calligraphy clubs left traces far more telling than fingerprints. The woman in the blue coat had been seen only once, but perhaps, just perhaps, she had left a mark. And if Miss Marple could match the handwriting, she might also find the killer. The village library, though modest in size, held an impressively thorough archive thanks to the tireless devotion of Mrs. Huxley, the former head librarian, who had spent 40 years curating every leaflet, birth announcement, and school newsletter with the reverence of a cathedral scribe. Miss Marple arrived just past 11, her gloves folded neatly into her handbag, her notebook tucked beside them. The library was quiet save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the hum of the radiator. At the back near the window, Clara Finch, the new librarian, a tidy woman in her early 50s with a fondness for lavender, looked up from her cataloging desk and offered a warm smile. Good morning, Miss Marple. Research today? Miss Marple smiled in return. Yes, Clara. If you wouldn't mind terribly, I'm interested in any recent Women's Institute newsletters, particularly the ones from the last 6 months, and perhaps anything handwritten, event minutes, sign-in sheets, committee notes. Clara blinked. That's quite specific. Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. I'm chasing a hunch. It may amount to nothing at all. With a little help from Clara and her well-indexed filing cabinet, they located 3 thick folders from the WI arc. One held typewritten monthly bulletins, another contained hand-addressed invitations, and the third, a battered blue ring binder, held committee sign-in logs and meeting minutes, most of them penned by a rotation of members. Miss Marple settled at a table beneath the large bay window, spreading the papers carefully across the surface. She removed the anonymous note from her handbag and set it beside her, comparing each handwritten entry line by line. At first there was nothing, the slanted scrawl of Miss Hartnell, the heavy looping letters of Dora Litchfield, the narrow, nervous printing of Hilary Godfrey, all wrong. She moved methodically, just as she did with her knitting, never skipping, never rushing, and then she found a single entry, written 3 months ago in the margins of a meeting note about the summer jumble sale, a quick apology for late arrival, initialed EC in small, neat cursive. It was unmistakable, the slope of the W, the open loop in the A, the restrained tail of the... It matched the note almost exactly. EC. Miss Marple turned the page, then flipped to the front of the binder, and traced the list of committee secretaries. The initials belonged to Eleanor Cray, Inspector Cray's sister, her mouth set in a thoughtful line. Eleanor had moved to the village only recently. She had attended a few WI meetings in the spring, then disappeared from public activity altogether. No one had spoken much about her. The assumption had been that she was recovering from some illness or perhaps grieving. A quiet woman who kept to herself and lived with her brother in the narrow white house just opposite the rectory. Miss Marple left the library without drawing attention, folding the note and her observations back into her handbag. The lane outside was lined with thinning trees, their leaves rattling faintly in the breeze. She walked with purpose, her steps light despite the growing weight of the truth forming in her mind. When she reached Inspector Cray's residence, she paused just long enough to note the curtains in the front parlor were drawn. Though the sun was warm enough to warrant light, she knocked twice. Inspector Cray answered himself. He looked weary, as if the case had begun to cling to his very bones. Miss Marple, he said, surprised. I wasn't expecting you. No, she agreed softly, but I think it's time we talked about Eleanor. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he stepped aside and allowed her in. The house smelled of tea and beeswax polish. A faint radio played something classical from another room. He led her to the small sitting room at the back, where books lined the walls and a single ashtray on the side table held the ghost of a cigarette recently crushed. She's resting, Cray said. She hasn't been herself. Miss Marple sat gently on the edge of a floral armchair. I believe she was with Mr. Lacey when he arrived in the village. Cray's eyes lifted. You're certain? Griselda Clement saw them arrive together, just before anyone knew who he was. Eleanor disappeared from public view shortly after. I also believe she wrote the note that was slipped through my door. He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back in the worn armchair across from her and pressed his fingertips together. She told me everything 2 nights ago, he said at last, after she found out Dorothy had died. Miss Marple waited, still and silent. They were friends, once, Eleanor and Daniel. It's all quite old, from the Lawrence years. Eleanor was a companion to Helena for a short time before her death. Daniel Lacey was there too, though he wasn't using that name then. Eleanor adored him. She always had. Cray's voice was tired. They were both present in the Lawrence house the night Helena died. Eleanor never believed Daniel was guilty, but she did believe he'd taken the fall for someone else. Someone in Helena's family, perhaps. He disappeared before the trial, changed his name, tried to vanish. Miss Marple murmured, but Eleanor couldn't forget. She found him again a few months ago, through an old acquaintance. They wrote letters, and eventually she convinced him to come here. She believed she could help him clear the last shadow of suspicion. She didn't expect Dorothy. No, Eleanor hadn't recognized her at first, but when Dorothy approached her, quietly, cautiously, it all came crashing down. Dorothy had remembered a photograph on a sideboard, a pair of cufflinks. She didn't accuse Daniel, but she was curious. She wanted to know who he really was, and Eleanor panicked. Cray nodded. She asked her not to dig, begged her, even. But Dorothy had a sense of justice. She said if it connected to a real murder, she couldn't stay quiet. And Eleanor, he trailed off. She didn't kill her, Miss Marple said gently. No, Cray whispered, but she confronted her. The night before Dorothy died, outside the pub, they argued. Eleanor says she left her safe, but she doesn't know if anyone saw them, or followed. The next morning, Dorothy was dead. Miss Marple folded her hands, and Eleanor has been living in terror ever since. Not of punishment, but of guilt. Cray nodded. She believes her presence led to Dorothy's death, that her own desperate loyalty allowed a killer to act unnoticed. Miss Marple looked out the window, where the trees stirred quietly against the afternoon sky. There's still someone else, she said. Someone who saw that argument. Someone who knew enough to act quickly. The question is, who stood most to lose if the Lawrence case were ever reopened? Cray's voice was brittle. You believe the original killer followed Eleanor here? I believe they never left, Miss Marple said. I believe someone in this village, perhaps not originally, but close enough, had reason to watch Mr. Lacey, and when Dorothy got too close, they saw their chance to finish what was started long ago. A silence followed, not heavy, but expectant. Outside, the wind picked up, a dog barked far off, and Miss Marple thought again of Millie's story. The man with the parcel, the shadows behind the dog and duck, the unusual detail of drugs, when no one else had even considered it. She rose. There's one more visit I need to make, she said, before dusk falls, and with that she left Inspector Cray to the weight of his family's silence. The past was catching up, and Miss Marple with quiet certainty was only a step behind it. The wind was sharper by the time Miss Marple reached the post office, the clouds overhead shifting in a slow, watchful churn. The village was quieter than usual for the hour. Children kept indoors, curtains drawn prematurely. There was an unease in the air now, not just mourning but suspicion, and under that, something older, fear perhaps, or memory. Millie looked up as Miss Marple entered, her smile tight. Good afternoon, she said, though her eyes flicked to the clock. You just caught me before close. Miss Marple nodded, stepping carefully over the threshold. I was hoping we might have a word, she said, privately. Millie stiffened, though only slightly. Is this about Dorothy? In a way, Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but direct. It's about what Dorothy saw, and what you said she mentioned. The girl hesitated, then gestured to the small counter gate, and let Miss Marple pass behind, into the narrow sorting room, where the smell of paper and ink clung like perfume. There was a wooden stool in the corner. Miss Marple remained standing. You said Dorothy saw something behind the dog and duck. A man. A parcel. Millie nodded, carefully folding a bundle of rubber bands in her hands. She did, or said she did, but I didn't press. She just seemed shaken. She mentioned drugs. Yes, though she laughed as she said it, like she was trying not to make too much of it. Miss Marple watched her still. And you never asked who the man was? Millie paused. She didn't say. No. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. But I think you already knew. There was a moment, just one, in which Millie's composure trembled. Her hands, still poised over the counter, curled inward. You told Dorothy to leave it alone. Miss Marple continued, but you didn't tell anyone else. Not the police. Not Inspector Cray. Not me. Because I didn't think it mattered, Millie whispered. I didn't think it had anything to do with what happened. But now, I don't know, she said. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, or that she had. But she was right, wasn't she? Miss Marple said softly. There was someone behind the dog and duck, someone meeting at odd hours. Someone who might have seen Dorothy talking to Eleanor Cray the night before she died. Someone who had every reason to make sure she stayed quiet. Millie sat down heavily on the stool. The tension in her face now gave way to something more painful than guilt. Reluctant clarity. It was Arthur Browning, she said. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The delivery man. Yes. He comes twice a week from Much Benham. Always on the same days, always late when the pub's winding down. I saw him once, months ago, handing something to a man outside. Not a parcel, a small case. I thought it might be money, or something worse. I never saw the other man clearly, just a shape, coat, hat. And I convinced myself it was nothing, but Dorothy saw more. I think she did, Millie said, her voice tight now. She saw Arthur again just before she died. She told me she'd remembered something odd about his van. A marking or a box that didn't belong. She said she was going to say something, but she didn't get the chance. Miss Marple nodded. Arthur Browning is not part of this village, but someone else is, someone who's been working with him. Millie looked up. You think that person killed her? I think that person saw what Dorothy knew and realized it was only a matter of time before she spoke up. The next hour passed quietly. Miss Marple left the post office with her thoughts settled, and her next step clear. She did not go to the police station. Not yet. Instead, she returned home, where her own hallway clock was chiming 5. She placed her gloves neatly in their dish, removed her shawl and went to her writing desk. Her hands moved quickly now, with practiced confidence. She wrote 3 short letters, each addressed to a different villager, each with a simple request. Would you be kind enough to join me for tea tomorrow at 3? I find myself in need of conversation and clarity. The names were written with care. Colonel Denham, Millie Thorne, Daniel Lacey, and then she wrote one more. This one had no name, just an address. The Dog and Duck. The next day dawned still and cold, the kind of morning that makes one think the earth is holding its breath. At precisely 3 o'clock, Miss Marple's small parlor was filled with the gentle clink of teacups and the faint scent of clove cake. Colonel Denham arrived first, gruff and polite, followed shortly by Millie, her eyes wary but steady. Daniel Lacey entered last, expression unreadable, hands folded behind his back. The 4th seat remained empty. Miss Marple served the tea herself, setting the cups with her usual grace. Conversation was quiet, cautious. She allowed it to meander for several minutes before she placed her cup down and looked at them one by one. I know who killed Dorothy, she said. They stilled. Colonel Denham leaned forward slightly. You know, Miss Marple nodded. Not because of fingerprint, not from evidence as such, but because of people, and what people do when they believe no one is watching. She turned first to Millie. You saw Arthur Browning. You suspected something, but you were not the only one. Then to Colonel Denham. You've known the pub's layout longer than anyone, and you've spent years, decades, cultivating the appearance of harmless routine. But that's all it is, isn't it? A performance. Denham's brow tightened. Dorothy didn't stumble into a stranger's mistake. Miss Marple continued, voice calm and unwavering. She saw a pattern, a man meeting another man behind the Dog and Duck. And she recognized the second man, not just as a face, but as a link to something buried years ago. Daniel Lacey said nothing, but his knuckles were white around the edge of his cup. Miss Marple's voice softened. It wasn't you, Daniel, but someone has been watching you. Someone who feared the truth of the Lawrence case might come back. Someone who used Browning's visits as cover. Someone local, respected, above suspicion. She looked again at Denham. You served in intelligence, did you not? He didn't answer, but his silence spoke enough. You recognized Daniel the moment he arrived. You who he really was, and you feared what he might bring with him. Dorothy was just a waitress to you, until she started asking questions. So you followed her, listened, watched, and when she talked to Eleanor that night, you realized it was only a matter of time. Denham stood, the chair scraping behind him. You have no proof. Miss Marple's voice remained even. You followed her into the garden. She turned to lock up after closing. She likely saw you and thought nothing of it. But you'd already made your decision. A quick strike. Quiet. Calculated. The kind of thing you once did for Queen and country. But now for yourself. Denham's hands clenched. Millie gasped. Miss Marple stood too, You were never the type to leave loose ends, Colonel. And Dorothy, poor sweet Dorothy, was never supposed to matter. But she did. She mattered because she saw there was a long silence. The clock ticked behind them. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice hoarse. Why? Why would he care? Miss Marple turned toward him. Because Denham was once a liaison to Helena Lawrence's estate. His name appears in old guest records. His unit trained near the property, and after her death, it was his silence that helped bury the truth. She looked back at the Colonel. You didn't kill Helena, but you knew who did. You helped bury it, and you couldn't afford for any of it to come up again. Not now. Not when it might pull everything down. The knock on the door was perfectly timed. Inspector Cray entered, his coat still damp from the lane, 2 constables behind him. Colonel Denham did not resist. He looked at Miss Marple with something between fury and grim acceptance. I should have known, he muttered. You've always watched more than you let on. Miss Marple gave a sad smile. That is the curse, Colonel, and the gift. When the door closed behind them, she returned to the hearth and poured what remained of the tea into the sink. Outside, the wind had softened. A bird sang faintly from the hedgerow. Justice had not come swiftly, nor loudly, but it had come, and in the way it always did in St. Mary Mead, quietly, decisively, with the kettle on, and no curtain ever quite closed. The days following Colonel Denham's quiet arrest passed with the slow, uncertain rhythm that often follows the uncovering of long-buried truth. The village of Mary Mead did not erupt into scandal, rather it sighed, an exhale of tension and whispers, of sideways glances exchanged in shop queues and sudden silences when a name was spoken. Denham, who had once stood at every remembrance ceremony with pride and precision, was now spoken of in hushed voices, as though to say too much aloud might rouse the ghosts he had spent a lifetime concealing. Miss Marple, though never one to seek attention, found herself the unspoken center of this shifting hush. Her neighbors, out of respect or weariness, said little to her directly, but she could feel it in their eyes, that subtle recognition that she had once again peeled back the pleasant facade of village life to reveal the veins of something darker beneath. She carried that awareness with grace, neither proud nor burdened, but with the weary understanding that truth once uncovered leaves no one untouched. On the 3rd morning after the arrest, Miss Marple received a visitor. Daniel Lacey arrived just after breakfast, his coat still damp with dew, his expression more open than it had ever been. He stood on her threshold, with a quiet humility, holding nothing but his hat in his hands. I hoped, he said, you might spare a few minutes. Miss Marple stepped aside without a word, and gestured toward the sitting room, where the fire was already lit and the tea service freshly set. He sat as though uncertain of his right to be there, the way a man might in a house he once knew but had long been away from. You knew, didn't you? He said softly, after a moment. Long before the police did, I suspected, Miss Marple replied, and I listened, which is often more important than speaking. He gave a faint, tired smile. It's strange. I came here thinking I might finally escape it, or perhaps confront it, but I never imagined it would end like this. You mean Denham's involvement? Daniel nodded. He was always near the periphery during those days, officially distant, but always watching. Helena feared him, I think, not for what he might do, but what he might know. You cared for her, Miss Marple said gently, not as a question. He looked into the fire. I did, in my way, but Eleanor, she was the one who tried to protect me. Even back then, she saw how I was being used as a distraction, a convenient scapegoat. When Helena died, I didn't run to avoid guilt. I ran because I knew it wouldn't matter whether I was innocent. They'd already decided. Miss Marple poured the tea with quiet hands. And Eleanor? She's gone to stay with a cousin. Inspector Cray thought it best. She blames herself, of course, not for what Denham did, but for bringing me here, for setting it all in motion. She shouldn't, Miss Marple said. The truth was already on its way. Dorothy saw to that. Daniel's expression darkened slightly. I wish I had known her better, had thanked her. She saw what others ignored. She saw because she paid attention, Miss Marple said. That's a rare gift. Most people are far too eager to assume. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional hiss from the fire. At last Daniel stood. "I'm leaving," he said. "Tomorrow. There's nothing for me here now, and I think it's time I stopped living as though my life ended with hers." "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Perhaps I'll teach, perhaps write, perhaps disappear again, but on my own terms this time." He hesitated. Would you tell Eleanor I came, that I was grateful?" Miss Marple nodded. "I will." He bowed his head, then turned and left with the soft finality of a man closing a chapter, not with bitterness, but with understanding. That evening the village held its autumn harvest supper in the church hall. There had been talk of cancelling it. Some said it felt inappropriate, so soon after such an unsettling event, but others, including Reverend Clement, insisted that life must go on, and that coming together might be exactly what the village needed. Miss Marple attended, as she always did, sitting quietly with her knitting basket at her feet, and a small plate of roast and root vegetables balanced on her lap. The conversation was gentler than usual, restrained, but slowly began to thaw as children played beneath the trestle tables, and the vicar offered a blessing that included, with careful phrasing, those recently departed, and those who now seek peace in other ways. It was late, the tables half cleared, and the musicians already packing their violins, when Millie approached her. She stood awkwardly, holding a cup of weak tea in one hand. "I've been meaning to thank you," she said, "not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You never made me feel foolish, even when I was." "You weren't foolish," Miss Marple said. "You were frightened." "That's not the same thing." Millie hesitated. "I keep thinking about Dorothy. If I'd said something earlier, if I'd pressed her more." "You might have changed nothing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Or you might have changed everything. But there's no way to know, and it isn't a kindness to punish yourself with questions that can't be answered." Millie nodded, her eyes wet, and then left with a quiet goodbye. The following morning, the first frost of the season coated the village green, leaving the grass silver and stiff beneath the sun. Miss Marple watched it from her window, a shawl wrapped over her shoulder. The dog and duck was quiet again, its shutters open but its garden still empty. No one had stepped behind the pergola since the constables had taken their measurements and photographs. That corner of the garden, once harmless, now held a memory that would take time to soften. Inspector Cray came that afternoon to deliver a final report. "It will be official soon," he said, standing just inside her hallway. "Denham's confession, not for Helena's death. He claims he still doesn't know who did it, but he's admitted to killing Dorothy. Said it was preempted." "She had the look of someone about to talk," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "That sounds like him." Cray looked down at his boots. He had files, records, blackmail material, names of people who could be hurt if the Lawrence case reopened. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "he didn't destroy them. No, I think part of him liked holding the truth, power disguised as silence. And now, they'll release Daniel's name officially. Clear it. Quietly, of course. And Eleanor, she's recovering. I think she'll come back, eventually. She left a letter for you, by the way." He handed her a small envelope, pale blue with careful handwriting. After he left, Miss Marple opened it slowly. The letter inside was short. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't, and for forgiving what I never dared admit. You reminded me that truth, even when painful, is always cleaner than hiding." No signature. None was needed. Miss Marple placed it in her writing desk, then walked slowly into the garden. The last roses were beginning to fall. The ivy had turned a deep russet, and the air carried the faint cleansing bite of the turning season. The world was not safer than before, but it was, for now, honest. And in St. Mary Mead, that was a victory worth noticing. The frost remained the next morning, crisp and sharp along the narrow lanes, and St. Mary Mead, though quieter than usual, resumed its slow, careful rhythm. But beneath the surface of returning normalcy, something still tugged at Miss Marple's thoughts. A small thread that hadn't yet found its place. She had reviewed every detail of Denham's confession, read through the inspector's report twice, and re-examined Eleanor's letter again under the soft morning light. And still something lingered at the edge of clarity. Dorothy's death had been explained, but not all of Dorothy's questions. Miss Marple sat in her parlor by the hearth, her knitting needles unmoving in her lap. A quiet rain had begun outside, fine and steady, veiling the village in a gentle hush. She reached into the drawer of her writing desk and removed the note Dorothy had received from the placement agency. Clara had quietly passed it to her through Inspector Cray once it was logged and reviewed. Miss Marple read it once more. No direct link to the Lawrence family, a placement near their estate, a vague memory of a sideboard photo, a pair of initials on a handkerchief. The letter had meant to reassure, but to Miss Marple's eye, it only introduced more fog. Daniel had fled to escape a false conviction. Yes, Denham had killed Dorothy to prevent the truth from resurfacing. That much was clear. But Helena Lawrence's murder, that had never been solved, and Denham had denied knowledge of it, even at the end. Miss Marple tapped the letter once, gently. Then she rose and reached for her coat. She took the walk slowly, her steps steady and deliberate. Rather than go through the village, she cut through the churchyard path and down the hedgerow toward the Hartwell guest house. She had one more conversation to finish. Miss Hartwell greeted her with brisk efficiency, cheeks flushed from baking, her apron still dusted in flour. "Another storm coming," she said by way of greeting. "The sky's thick with it. I won't take much of your time," Miss Marple said kindly. "Just one question. Do you recall the morning Mr. Lacey arrived?" "Of course. Quiet man. Had a single suitcase and paid in full. Was he alone when he checked in?" Mrs. Hartwell paused. "Well, yes, as far as I saw, though someone had come in just before. Young woman, very polite. She said she was asking about a room for her uncle. Never gave a name." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she stay long?" "No, only a few minutes. Then she stepped out again. I assumed she was a niece or companion." "And did you see her again?" "No, now that you mention it, I never did." Miss Marple thanked her, returned to the lane, and stood under the arching branches of the birch tree just outside the gate. The rain had grown colder now, and the sky sagged with low gray clouds. She thought back to Griselda's remark, the woman in the blue coat walking swiftly away the morning Lacey arrived. Eleanor, by her own admission, had been with him, but Eleanor hadn't described a blue coat. In fact, she had claimed she hadn't been in the village at all until weeks later. Miss Marple had accepted it at the time, thinking Eleanor's reluctance to name herself merely a symptom of shame and guilt. But perhaps it was something else. She turned and walked back toward the village center, her mind now moving quickly beneath the calm surface. At the library, she found Clara Finch closing up for the afternoon. "I need to trouble you one last time," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you still keep back issues of the Hampshire Herald?" Clara looked puzzled, but nodded. "Yes, all the way back to... They're in the reference room, right-hand shelf." It didn't take long. The articles were yellowed and brittle but clearly preserved. Miss Marple read with the patience of someone used to listening for silence between notes. The Lawrence case had garnered national attention in its day. Helena Lawrence's sudden death in her private conservatory, the bottle of Madeira laced with cyanide, the dismissed cook, the vanished valet. But then on the fourth page of the August 1934 issue, there was a photograph, grainy but distinct, of the household in happier day. Miss Marple leaned closer. Helena, her sister-in-law, 2 guests, and one young woman standing behind the group, partially turned away. She wore a slim scarf and a coat with a wide collar. The caption listed her name, Miss Vera Hartnell, companion. Miss Marple blinked. She read the name again. Then she quietly closed the newspaper, thanked Clara, and returned home beneath the drizzle, her shoes soaking through on the walk. It was never Eleanor who had arrived early with Daniel. It had been someone else entirely. Vera Hartnell. She had been there at the Lawrence estate, and now, all these years later, she ran the guest house where Daniel Lacey had booked his quiet escape. That night, Miss Marple sat long at her writing table, her fingers resting on the rim of her teacup, untouched. The memory of Mrs. Hartwell's face returned to her, open, pleasant, careful, but not honest. And the name Hartwell was common enough. But Vera Hartnell had no known surviving family. So who exactly was Mrs. Hartwell? The next morning, Miss Marple walked again to the vicarage. This time she did not seek Griselda, but Reverend Clement himself. "May I trouble you for a look at the church records?" she asked, her voice as soft as ever. "Specifically those relating to the Hartwell family, their arrival, residency, and any prior name changes." He looked at her with mild surprise but offered no protest. It took only 10 minutes. Hartwell, Vera, born Vera Hartnell, changed her name by deed poll in no marriage, no listed family, no local kin, occupation private companion and housekeeper. Arrived in St. Mary Mead in 1950, purchased the guest house from a retiring widow, with a loan drawn on an unlisted fund. Miss Marple closed the records slowly. She returned home and took out the last remaining note from her desk, the one Dorothy had received from the placement agency. "You were placed with the Kingsleys in Hampshire, just outside Barton Green. You were not placed directly with the Lawrence household, but their properties were very near one another." Miss Marple underlined the word Kingsleys, and remembered, with a dull ache of certainty, that Vera Hartnell had been listed as companion to Miss Kingsley 2 years before her time at the Lawrence estate. She had simply moved between houses, and seen everything. It was possible that Vera, Mrs. Hartwell, had never killed anyone. But it was also possible she had known who did, had helped conceal it. And when Daniel returned, when Eleanor reappeared, and when Dorothy started asking questions, she must have seen the old danger stirring again. She had seen Denham grow nervous. Perhaps she encouraged it, perhaps she let it happen. Miss Marple would not call the police. Instead she penned a letter. A short one. "Mrs. Hartwell, you were not the one who killed Dorothy, but you were the one who opened the door. You've kept secrets long enough. Perhaps now it is time to let them go. If you wish to speak, I will be here." She signed it without flourish, and walked it to the guest house herself, slipping it through the letterbox. That evening, the village slept uneasily beneath a bruised sky, and somewhere behind shuttered windows, a woman sat very still, holding a note in trembling hands. The past finally laid at her feet. The storm, it seemed, had not yet passed, but at last it had a name. It was nearly dusk by the time the knock came, soft, hesitant, and entirely unlike the firm taps of the vicar, or the polite raps of the constable. Miss Marple had been expecting it. She had not moved far from her chair since returning from the guest house, her knitting laid neatly beside her, untouched. The air in the parlor had cooled, the fire crackling faintly as if in anticipation. When she opened the door, Miss Hartwell stood there, not in her usual pressed apron and practical shoes, but in a dark coat, collar turned up, gloved hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl summoned for punishment. Her face was pale, not panicked, not tearful, but emptied of the pleasant reserve she usually wore like armor. Miss Marple stepped aside without a word, letting her pass into the warm stillness of the room. The two women faced one another for a long moment, neither speaking. Miss Hartwell removed her gloves, slowly, setting them down beside the sugar dish on the tea table. She did not sit. "I suppose you've known for some time," she said, her voice low and flat, the kind of voice that had been rehearsed privately too many times to carry any natural inflection. "I suspected," Miss Marple replied, "and today I confirmed it." Mrs. Hartwell looked at the fire, not the woman in front of her. "I never thought I'd be here this long. I told myself 5 years, long enough to settle, to disappear without being noted. But then 5 became 10, and 10 became the rest of my life. People often believe silence is safety," Miss Marple said gently, "but it isn't. It's simply the slow burial of something that never died." Mrs. Hartwell sat then, carefully, as though the weight of her past might splinter the chair beneath her. She took a breath, not deep, but deliberate. "It wasn't Daniel. I knew that even then. The police, the newspapers, everyone painted him as the ideal suspect, the quiet one, the friend without family. Helena trusted him, so they assumed betrayal. But I knew, I saw." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you see, Vera?" Mrs. Hartwell blinked. At the name something in her seemed to crack, not shatter but give, like a beam under slow pressure. Her hands clutched one another in her lap. "I was in the hallway," she said, staring at the fire. "I had just taken up the supper tray to Mrs. Lawrence's bedroom. She often ate late. When I came back down, I heard voices in the conservatory. It was supposed to be empty. She never let anyone in after dusk. Said the cold made her joints ache. But I heard raised voices, not angry, urgent, and then silence, sudden. Her gaze dropped to her hand. I didn't go in. I waited, just behind the doorway, by the sideboard with the jade figurine. I heard the glass decanter being moved. A step. Then the door opened, and I saw him come out. "Colonel Denham," Miss Marple said softly. Vera nodded once. He didn't see me. He moved fast, like someone trying not to be seen, but pretending not to care. He straightened his cuffs in the hall mirror. Then he left through the side door. It wasn't until later, after the maid screamed, that I realized Helena was dead. "And you said nothing." Vera's eyes rose for the first time. "What would you have had me say?" "That I saw a man leave a room, that I thought I heard tension in his voice. There was no proof, no poison on his hands, and I had secrets of my own." Miss Marple didn't speak, allowing the silence to press in gently, urging more. "I had been let go from the Kingsleys," Vera said after a pause. "Not for anything dreadful, but I knew things, personal things. The sort of things that, if repeated, would ruin reputations. I was discreet, but not enough. When I was offered work at the Lawrence estate, I didn't ask why. I needed the income. But I also knew I wasn't hired solely for my skills." "You were a buffer," Miss Marple said. "Someone they could trust not to ask questions." "Yes." Her mouth twisted faintly, and I upheld that trust. Even when Helena died, even when Daniel ran, I stayed silent. I thought it was the safest thing. "But silence rarely stays still," Miss Marple murmured. "It moves, it spreads, and eventually it rots." Vera looked away. "When Daniel booked the guest house, I didn't recognize the name at first. But when I saw his face, all of it came back. And Eleanor, her visit, her presence, it shook everything loose. And then Dorothy. Dorothy saw more than she was meant to," Miss Marple finished gently. "She was curious," Vera said. "Too curious. I warned her off once, said Mr. Lacey was private, that the past was better left alone. She didn't listen." "Did you tell Denham?" Vera's voice turned brittle. "No, but I didn't need to. Denham was always watching. He had a way of sniffing out tremors before they became earthquakes. When Dorothy started making inquiries, when she asked about the placement agency, when she lingered behind the pub after closing, I saw his expression change. Just once. That was enough. You knew what he'd do." "I suspected, and I said nothing." The fire cracked once, sharp in the hush. Miss Marple nodded, slowly. "You didn't kill her, but you allowed it. You stepped aside and let the machine you once escaped run again." Vera's shoulders sagged. "I told myself it wouldn't go that far, that she'd back off. But she didn't." There was a long pause. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Vera said. "I'm not sure I deserve it." "No one is," Miss Marple replied. "But that doesn't mean it isn't worth seeking." Vera looked at her then, truly looked. "What happens now?" "That depends," Miss Marple said. "You can confess to Inspector Cray, or you can leave. But understand this, whether you remain or vanish, your silence has already broken. The truth is known. The village, whether they realize it yet or not, has already adjusted." Vera rose, slowly. Her face was lined with something deeper than age. "I'll speak to Cray," she said, "but not yet. Tomorrow morning. I need." She paused, searching for a word to gather myself. Miss Marple stood as well. "Very well, but do not wait too long." Vera Hartwell stepped into the gray drizzle outside, her coat soaked through before she reached the gate. Miss Marple watched until she turned the corner, her figure disappearing into the fog. That night, the rain intensified. The rooftops drummed steadily, and the gutters ran dark with the wash of rotted leaves. But inside the cottage, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, knitting at last. Each stitch was precise, deliberate, comforting. Outside, the storm spent itself, and morning crept closer. And somewhere beyond the hedgerows and dim window panes, the truth, long frozen, had begun, at last to thaw. The rain had eased by morning, leaving behind a pale, softened village sky, and the glistening hush of soaked hedgerow. A thin mist clung low over the fields, and the chimneys of St. Mary Mead exhaled slow, contented plumes into the chilled air. Miss Marple, up before dawn as always, moved quietly through her small kitchen, setting tea to steep and slicing a modest wedge of currant loaf. It was the kind of morning that promised an ending, not abrupt or dramatic, but steady, inevitable, and well-earned. At 9:30 sharp, Vera Hartwell arrived at the police station. She wore the same coat as the night before, buttoned high, her posture composed but no longer defiant. Inside, Inspector Cray received her without comment, simply gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Miss Marple had already briefed him, her observations laid out with characteristic restraint and clarity. There were no accusations, only patterns, names, and dates stitched together with the precision of someone who had long understood the weight of unfinished things. Vera spoke for nearly 20 minutes. She confirmed what Miss Marple had already uncovered: her presence at the Lawrence estate, her memory of Denham leaving the conservatory, her choice to say nothing then, and her quiet decision to remain silent again when she realized Dorothy Pindle had begun to suspect the same truth. She hadn't warned Denham directly, she said, but she hadn't needed to. Their shared past was woven through with the kind of unspoken understanding that made explicit warnings unnecessary. I enabled him, she finished, her voice barely audible, not with malice, but with fear. I told myself it was loyalty, or survival, but it was cowardice, and it cost Dorothy her life. Cray said little. He listened, nodded, and recorded the statement. When she had signed it, she stood as if awaiting a sentence. He regarded her a long moment. You won't be charged for Dorothy's death, he said. There's no direct evidence of complicity, but the file on the Lawrence case, your testimony will go there. Officially, that part of the story at least will no longer be missing. Vera nodded once. That's all I ever owe. She left without further ceremony, disappearing back into the gray morning. Her figure shrinking into the mist had always seemed to hang over St. Mary Mead in the wake of revelations. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the Dog and it had been reopened, cautiously, respectfully, under Terry's management. The back garden remained cordoned off, and few patrons lingered long, but there was comfort in small routines: the clink of glasses, the hum of subdued conversation, the scraping of chairs on stone. She ordered tea and took her usual seat by the hearth. Daniel Lacey had departed 2 days earlier, his quiet farewell folded into a letter delivered by the vicar's wife. He had written nothing dramatic, only a single line that remained with her: "Thank you for seeing the truth, without needing to destroy the man buried beneath it." Eleanor, it was said, had taken up work in a small school library outside Winchester. Whether she would return to Mary Mead remained uncertain, but Miss Marple suspected she would not. Some places, once unmasked, could never again offer the comfort of forgetting. Millie passed by the table and offered her a small wave. Her eyes were clearer now, her posture more grounded. She had begun volunteering with the village children, helping at the reading hour each Wednesday. Miss Marple saw in her the beginning of something, not redemption, but quiet growth. As for Inspector Cray, he returned to his duties with little fanfare. He spoke no more about his sister's connection to the case, nor did he challenge the unspoken conclusion that Vera Hartwell's silence had been the final thread in a tapestry too long hidden. In his way, he seemed older now, not diminished, but sober, and he had begun walking with a slight limp, as if the weight of truth had finally taken a toll on the leg he once injured during training. The village adjusted, as it always did. Whispers faded, curtains reopened, life, ever so gently, resumed. And in the quiet of her parlor 1 week later, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the latest pattern forming cleanly beneath her fingers. A scarf this time, pale blue, soft wool. She thought of Dorothy, sharp-eyed, brave, curious to a fault; of Eleanor, caught between past and loyalty; of Vera, buried in layers of names, years, and choices; and of Daniel, who had once carried suspicion like a shadow stitched to his heels, now walking somewhere unknown, finally lighter. It had not been a case of blood and revenge, nor of traps and clever deductions. No, it had been, as always, about people, about the small cruelties they justify, the quiet silences they maintain, and the threads they believe will never unravel. But in the end, they always do, because someone somewhere is always watching, always listening, and always quietly pulling on the right string. Miss Marple smiled faintly, turned her wool and stitched the next row. The village clock chimed 4, and outside St. Mary Mead exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness, for another secret, another silence, would surely come again.